Welcome to the Geostrategic Podcast.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We're tackling, well, a really fascinating intersection today. Financial warfare, maritime logistics, which are incredibly complex, and of course, global geopolitics. Our mission really is to unpack a stack of sources focused squarely on Iran's oil exports. We're looking specifically at that crucial trade relationship with China, trying to figure out the practical steps needed, to make sanctions actually work.
Yeah, we really need to look past the sort of political declarations, the big statements, and get right into the mechanics of enforcement. How does this stuff actually function on the ground? The core question, I think, is pretty fundamental. Can sanctions move from just being, let's say, symbolic gestures to creating genuine substantive pressure, especially when you're dealing with Tehran, which, let's be honest, has become incredibly adept at sanctions busting? And the answer to that question, it directly impacts how much real strategic leverage is generated against a regime that absolutely relies on that oil money.
Okay, yeah, let's unpack that, because the scale of the challenge is just huge. Despite the UN's snapback sanctions being reimposed, and these cover everything, right? Arms, finance, energy investment. Our data shows Tehran is still managing to ship crude oil out in massive volumes. I mean, we're talking an average of, get this, 1.8 million barrels per day so far in 2025. That's staggering.
It is staggering. And that number is dangerously close to what they were exporting before major sanctions hit. And critically, as you said, most of that oil is going to one place, China. It's often facilitated by these steep discounts, lots of deceptive shipping practices, and that infamous shadow fleet of tankers. So without really rigorous enforcement, focus laser-like on the actual choke points of this trade, well, those revive sanctions. They're just words on paper, honestly.
Which brings us right to Section 1. This pretty significant gap between the law of the sanctions and the actual outcome we're seeing. So the snapback sanctions, legally, they reinstate tough standards like zero enrichment, strict restrictions. But why hasn't the regime's behavior really changed fundamentally yet, according to the analysis we looked at?
Well, the analysis is quite clear on this. The regime's calculus, its behavior, it only really shifts when enough cost is imposed on the essential infrastructure that lets them generate that revenue. It's about the tankers, the refineries, the banks. Tehran knows that as long as the oil keeps moving and the money finds a way through, then appearances can often substitute for real pressure, especially if enforcement is, shall we say, patchy. They definitely count on the global system, often prioritizing efficiency over strict compliance.
Exactly. So the legal bans don't mean much if the whole logistical chain stays unbroken. If the tankers keep sailing, if those teapot refiners in China keep processing the crude, and if the banks somehow manage to clear the payments, then that 1.8 million barrel per day revenue stream, it just keeps flowing, largely untouched.
And that's why enforcement has to stop just, naming names on a list and start actively hitting the crucial transactional nodes. If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is precisely where the U.S. and its allies can gain some concrete leverage over that specific Iran-China trade axis. We have to target the three core choke points: maritime transport, refinery intake, and financial clearance.
And what's really interesting here, I found, is that the sources aren't demanding sweeping new laws or anything. They lay out 5 pretty straightforward practical steps. And they're all grounded in authorities that already exist. These steps are designed to be sequenced, rolled out one after another for maximum impact, really chipping away at Iran's ability to exploit the global system.
Okay, so let's dive into Pillar 1, choking off the insurance. This is where it gets, I think, really interesting, because the international group, the IG of P&I clubs, these guys provide pretty much the only form of liability coverage that's accepted by major ports and refiners worldwide.
Right, P&I, that's protection and indemnity insurance. So covering huge liabilities, things like oil spills, major accidents, crew issues, that kind of thing.
Exactly that. Massive, potentially ruinous costs.
So if you hit their insurance, you're basically pulling their global license to operate. Is that the idea?
That's precisely the idea. Without that recognized P&I cover from an IG member, a tanker is almost like a pariah ship. It simply can't enter something like 90% of the world's legitimate ports because the financial risk for the port is just far too high. So enforcement here means conditioning this absolutely critical coverage on verifiable proof of legitimate trade, things like uninterrupted AIs tracking the ship's transponder signal.
Yes.
Validated bills of lading the cargo documents and clear port histories, no unexplained gaps.
Hold on, the AIS tracking, you mentioned that. For listeners maybe not leap in maritime stuff, AIS is basically the ship's GPS transponder. It tells everyone where it is. But we know Iran's shadow fleet is notorious for switching it off, right? Or spoofing the signal. They go dark for weeks sometimes to do those ship-to-ship transfers out at sea.
Exactly. That's a key tactic. So verifying the AIS history means making absolutely sure the vessel hasn't gone dark to hide an illicit transfer, often in places like the Malacca Strait or off the coast of Malaysia. The mechanism proposed is actually quite simple. Any vessel that fails this kind of basic verification, it should lose its IG recognition immediately. And if ports and refiners globally are required to refuse cargo from any ship without those recognized IG certificates, well, you dramatically shrink the number of usable tankers available to Iran, and you significantly drive up their operating costs.
Okay, that sounds like a structural fix, hitting the system itself. Now, speaking of the ships, Pillar 2 takes aim at that shadow fleet directly. These are often, as you said, really old vessels. Lots are over 20 years old that Iran uses. They're constantly reflagging them, hopping between classification societies to dodge scrutiny.
And here's the, well, almost elegant part of this strategy. You don't necessarily need a brand new sanctions law or some big UN resolution to tackle these specific ships. Many of these vessels are, frankly, barely seaworthy. They're often held together by, rust and hope. Under existing international maritime safety conventions like SOLAS or MARPOL, port state control authorities, basically, maritime inspectors in ports around the world already have the power to detain unsafe ships.
So it's kind of like the harbor master acting like a traffic cop, pulling over a ship for being dangerously unroadworthy or unseaworthy in this case.
That's a perfect analogy. The ship gets detained for safety violations, faulty navigation gear, structural issues, inadequate safety equipment, you name it. The specific mechanism proposed is simply prioritizing tankers, known or suspected to be linked to Iranian trade, for these routine safety inspections. This naturally accelerates detentions. It leads to classification societies withdrawing their approval, which is another nail in the coffin for the ship's operability. And eventually it forces the scrapping of these unsafe hulls. It's a gradual but effective way to reduce Iran's illicit transport capacity over time, often using existing safety rules, which makes it less politically charged.
Okay, so we've talked about shrinking the supply side, fewer insured, safe ships available, and making the fleet more vulnerable through inspections. Now we have to deal with the demand side. Where is all this crude actually ending up? And that brings us to Pillar 3, terminal and refinery accountability. This seems absolutely vital when we talk about that Iran-China connection.
It really is. Since the vast majority of Iran's discounted crude oil ends up in China, specifically feeding its independent, or teapot, refining sector targeting the recipients is arguably the quickest way to impose costs. And perhaps more importantly, it forces Beijing to actually pay attention to the issue.
But okay, here's the pushback, right? Doesn't sanctioning Chinese domestic refiners or terminals risk escalating trade tensions way beyond just targeting Iran? Is that political cost really worth the potential reduction in Iranian revenue?
That's absolutely the key tension here. It's a delicate balance. But the sources argue that targeted, specific, and maybe most importantly, institutionalized pressure can work without necessarily blowing up the whole relationship. And they point to concrete examples from earlier this year that suggest this approach has teeth. For instance, direct U.S. sanctions targeting one specific Chinese entry point. The Haidong-Diakou terminal almost immediately forced oil shipments to divert to other nearby ports like Huangdao. That diversion itself created logistical headaches and, crucially, widened the discount Iran had to offer to sell its oil, directly hitting their profit margin.
So immediate financial pain, even from a targeted action.
Exactly. And in another case, sanctions on just 2 Shandong teapot refiners prompted the entire provincial port authority group to publicly state they would reject cargoes heading to those specific refiners. That sends a powerful signal. So the proposed action isn't about sanctioning all of China, but institutionalizing this, creating and maintaining a rolling public list of specific terminals and refineries repeatedly caught handling deceptive or sanctioned cargoes. This constrains the available outlets for Iranian oil bit by bit. And importantly, it dramatically raises the risk and cost for those Chinese buyers. Remember, these refiners often value reliability and speed much more than just getting the absolute cheapest barrel, especially if that barrel comes with regulatory headaches and potential sanctions risk.
Okay, that makes sense. Shifting gears now to the money side. The last 2 pillars deal with the financial aspect. How does all that oil, that 1.8 million barrels a day, actually turn into cash that Tehran can use? We know they use these complex networks of shell companies, often registered in places like Hong Kong or the UAE, plus various exchange houses, to basically launder the proceeds.
Right. And traditional sanctions, just listing individual companies, often struggle to keep up. Tehran can set up shell companies faster than authorities can designate them. They designate one, three new ones pop up the next day. It's a constant game of whack-a-mole.
Yeah, seems incredibly hard to police. So, mechanism 4, the transparency pillar, what does that involve?
This requires regular, very detailed advisories coming from bodies like the U.S. Treasury's OFAC, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, and FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. But these advisories need to go beyond just listing names. They need to identify both the specific entities involved and, crucially, the typologies of money laundering being used.
Typologies, so like the specific methods they're using.
Exactly. The patterns, the structures. For example, consistently using Hong Kong-registered front companies that funnel funds through a particular type of unregulated exchange house based in the UAE, or using specific commodity trading schemes to disguise payments. Providing this level of detail, this clarity on the how, enables global banks, the big international ones, to much more rapidly identify and exit any exposure they might have. They don't need to wait for a specific company they deal with to be officially sanctioned. They can see the pattern described in the advisory matches their client's activity and proactively de-risk. This forces Iran into even riskier, more obscure, and ultimately costlier financial channels, often outside the well-regulated international banking system altogether.
Got it. And finally, Pillar 5 gets personal, right? It focuses on the human element because these shell companies, these complex schemes, they need actual people to run them. If you only sanction the company name, they just hire someone else or use a different frontman tomorrow.
Precisely. Tehran relies on a relatively small, but highly trusted and competent network of operatives, people who understand international finance, logistics, maritime law, how to exploit the system. So the mechanism here is simple but potent. Target the key personnel. Sanction the board members, the C-level executives, the major shareholders, the managers of these front companies and networks. The goal isn't just to disrupt the current cash flow, but to actively shrink the pool of competent, experienced, and trusted operatives that Tehran can actually rely on for these illicit operations. It makes it harder for them to manage the complexity of sanctions evasion over time.
Okay, so if we pull all 5 pillars together, you can see how they're designed to work in sequence, creating this kind of compounding pressure. Insurance and port rules shrink the usable fleet, make shipping riskier. Terminal accountability narrows the buyers, putting direct pressure on that China link. And the financial steps make it harder and more expensive to actually get the money back home and use it.
Exactly. If they're sequenced correctly and, crucially, enforced consistently, these measures systematically exploit structural weaknesses in the illicit trade. They relentlessly drive up transaction costs for Iran. They reduce the netbacks, that's the actual profit Iran gets per barrel, after all the discounts, the extra shipping costs, the money laundering fees. Even if they still manage to move some volume, the profitability plummets. And that's how sanctions move from being merely symbolic statements to having a substantive, tangible impact on the regime's finances.
So let's talk bottom line. What does this all mean for the big picture, the geopolitical dynamics, especially involving China? The sources suggest there's a pretty clear scorecard we can use to measure effectiveness.
Yes, they lay out some concrete benchmarks. Within months, not years, but months of truly rigorous enforcement across all 5 of these pillars, the sources predict that Iranian exports should drop significantly. They should fall back towards the kind of levels seen during the peak of the previous maximum pressure campaign, which was around 800,000 barrels per day on average.
Wow, okay, that's less than half the current level, a huge drop in revenue. What other signs should we, or you the listener, be watching for?
Well, a few key indicators. First, the discount that Tehran is forced to offer China or other remaining buyers should widen considerably. That reflects the increased risk and hassle involved. Second, we should see a clear, measurable increase quarter over quarter in the number of Iranian-linked tankers being detained for safety reasons, deflagged by registries, or even sent for scrapping because they're too risky or costly to operate. And third, crucially, the actual oil throughput, the volume, being processed at those specifically targeted terminals and refineries, particularly in China, must show consistent decline. That proves the pressure on buyers is working.
And this really gets to the heart of the geostrategic tension, doesn't it? And how these sanctions, if enforced this way, could fundamentally alter Iran-China relations. The snapback mechanism creates the law, the legal basis. But, as the sources stress, if Western governments just settle for those declarations, if they neglect this kind of specific, granular, often difficult enforcement, then Iran just continues financing its regional activities, business as usual, more or less.
That's the absolute crux of it. Consistent, rigorous application of these kinds of enforcement measures raises the tension precisely because it directly hits Iran's economic lifeline to China. But it also inevitably creates friction with China by impacting its domestic refining sector and import flows. It forces Beijing into a difficult, costly calculation. Does it tolerate major disruption or risk in a critical energy sector just to keep buying discounted Iranian oil? Or does it start applying its own pressure on Tehran to moderate its behavior and return to some form of compliance? That dynamic, forcing that choice, changes the entire strategic landscape. It creates real leverage where maybe before there was mostly just rhetoric and symbolic actions.
So it really does all come down to sustained commitment, focused on those key choke points: the insurance, the ports, the banks, the terminals. The sources we reviewed make a very clear, compelling case. Consistent, nitty-gritty enforcement isn't just one option. It's presented as the only way to meaningfully erode Tehran's oil revenues and achieve those broader strategic goals, like curbing funds for regional destabilization.
And thinking about that level of enforcement, it raises a really interesting, maybe provocative question for you, the listener, to consider. Given how utterly reliant the entire global economy is on maritime trade and the sheer complexity of implementing these measures consistently across different jurisdictions, how quickly and in what ways would this kind of intensive enforcement on Iranian trade start to shift broader international shipping norms? Could it change how high-risk trade, not just involving Iran, is insured, monitored, and conducted everywhere? Something to think about.
Definitely food for thought. Well, thank you for allowing us to take this deep dive into your source material today. We really hope this breakdown gave you the useful knowledge nuggets you were looking for. And if you did find this useful, we absolutely encourage you to check out our other deep dives where we unpack complex global issues and the sources behind them, just like this one. Thanks for tuning in. If you found this discussion valuable, please like, share, and subscribe to the Geostrategic Podcast for more in-depth analysis on topics that shape our world. Stay informed, stay ahead, and stay tuned for the next episode.